right. Are we scary enough?
Yeah.
So I want to preface this by saying that my thesis work mostly does not deal with actually defining horror. My thesis work is approaching horror from a perspective of cultural rhetorics, which involves all sorts of things, but usually not actually dealing with the definition of horror. However, in my research, I frequently find that I'm stuck with this question. As I'm watching movies or reading books or playing games and talking about them with people, I find I'm consistently stuck wondering what it means for something to be horror. And all the discussions I've had with people about that have led me to this presentation that I've prepared for you today. So let's start in November of the previous year. Stephen Karam came out with a movie called The Humans. I had never heard of this movie until I listened to a podcast episode about it, posted by the Faculty of Horror podcast. And the episode I was listening to came out in January. It was a year in review type episode where the co-hosts worked together to talk about all the horror that came out in 2021 and rate their top 10 and all those lovely things. Alex West, one of the co-hosts of this podcast, named The Humans as her #1 horror pick of 2021. She's been doing this podcast since 2012, so she's not remotely inexperienced. This is kind of a big deal. And not only did she say it's her #1 horror pick of 2021, but she also said this, that The Humans poses a really important question to us right now in 2021 or 2022, with where the world is, with what we're all going through with this collective trauma. By this, I assume she is talking about the pandemic. What does that mean? What does that yield? And what is horror now? To her, The Humans fills that gap. It answers that question. It's not just the #1 horror of the year for Alex West. It's also the first in a new era of horror, the way she sees it. However, if you've ever heard of The Humans or seen it, you probably know that most people don't even consider it to be horror at all, let alone the best horror of 2021. It was never marketed as horror. The trailer in which it was announced declared it to be a masterful family drama. IMDb has simply labeled it drama with no other labels whatsoever. A review from The Atlantic admitted that it was scary, but not horror. And still, the author of that article, Shirley Lee, admits that more than once she found herself gripping her armrests, terrified. I think this leaves us in a place of wondering what exactly it means when we call a narrative horror. How is it possible that a horror veteran like Alex West can name The Humans as her #1 horror pick of the year, while other very reputable sources say it's not even horror at all? I think part of the problem is that when we think about genre and when we think about horror, we often fall into patterns that we're used to. And the pattern we're used to, it seems to me, is traditionally one that is criteria-based. For instance, if I were to ask you all if you consider the movie Jaws to be horror, regardless of your answer, probably what you're doing the moment I ask you that question is in your head pulling up a bunch of criteria to determine for yourself if Jaws fits that generic mold. For instance, maybe you're asking yourself, does Jaws include a monster? Are there supernatural or sci-fi elements? Is there gore or are there jump scares? Or maybe even simply, is it scary? The thing is, horror has evolved and changed a lot over its history, and we are now in a place where this criteria-based approach doesn't cover all the subgenres, not even close. We could use this sort of criteria-based approach for maybe one of the subgenres by itself, for instance, slasher movies. It's a lot easier to put that in a bulleted list. But when it comes to horror, broadly speaking, we don't really have a good set of criteria. Philosopher Noel Carroll attempted to solve this problem a little bit. He is one of the foremost thinkers in horror studies, and his definition is probably better than most people's checklists of horror. His consideration is that horror is a narrative that features a monster of supernatural or science fiction origin. That monster must also be threatening and impure in some sense. The characters in that narrative must respond to the monster with both fear and revulsion, and the audience must have an embodied response to horror, which means something like chills, or your heart skipping or beating fast, or something like that. And while I respect Noel Carroll very much for his contribution to the studies, the problem that I find myself facing is that this is still a criteria-based approach. This is still a list of points, and we end up in funny places when we're talking about a movie, let's say Halloween, for instance, where the monster is neither supernatural nor science fiction in origin, and yet, broadly speaking, we consider that to be horror. What I propose to you instead of a series of lists of bullet points of different criteria, I just have one criteria for horror. And that is that horror must be a narrative that depicts monstrosity. And monstrosity is defined as the distillation of a cultural threat. And we know it's a cultural threat because audiences will experience what Asa Mittman calls vertigo, as audience members are forced to redefine their understanding of their world as their worldview is challenged. This way, we can have a definition of horror that is not limited to things that are supernatural or sci-fi in origin. Now we can have human monsters like Michael Myers, or we can have situations that are monstrous, like, for instance, The Purge or Squid Game. I would like to apply this idea to two films that are frequently denied their horror status. And by denied, I mean informally in conversations, but also denied by that one almighty power, IMDb, which considers these to be thrillers at best. Silence of the Lambs and Black Swan. But I think if we re-examine these from a perspective of cultural threat, I think we can see that these are, in fact, horror. Let's start with Hannibal Lecter. Hannibal is an intellectual elite. His intelligence is off the charts. Normally, in our culture, we value that. However, Hannibal is also completely and utterly amoral, and he feeds on those around him. So we're stuck in a dichotomy where the thing that we culturally value is also the thing that is likely to eat your liver with a plate of fava beans and a nice Chianti. And therein lies the cultural threat. With Black Swan, Nina herself is not a monster. At least I don't perceive her that way. But the circumstance of the character, it's the circumstance that is monstrous. And the cultural threat in this one I see as being antithetical to what we consider to be the American dream. In Black Swan, Nina is working hard to achieve the kind of success that most Americans can only dream of. And she gets there. But in the process, she sacrifices her body, her her sanity, and ultimately her life. And despite that sacrifice, she is still abused and controlled every step along the way. And I think what happens when we watch a narrative like this is that even though I suspect most of us are not ballerinas, we begin to see that maybe some of the unreasonable stresses and demands and costs that Nina has to face are things that we're uncomfortably familiar with in our own lives. And therein lies the cultural threat. I want to push this a little further. I've been taking to Twitter to poll people, which is what I do. It's awfully fun. I encourage you to try it. And I've been asking this question: what movie exemplifies the horror genre? I usually get responses like The Shining, or Night of the Living Dead, or Halloween, or things like that. One person on Twitter and I quickly, or I should say he quickly realized that he had misunderstood my question, which is fair. And I chuckled about it, and then I stopped chuckling. And I was like, and I commented, but what if it is? His response, I think, is exactly the sort of thing we should be thinking about as we are expanding the definition of horror, as we are seeking to revisit and understand things beyond what we're used to. Young woman in a house with shifting geometry goes looking into buried family secrets. Everyone thinks that by not talking about the secrets, they won't be an issue, but it doesn't help. That which they repress is figuratively and literally haunting them, living in the walls. In the end, it turns out that a deep generational trauma replicated itself and grew and mutated to where everyone was hurt by it, and it can only be resolved through the inevitable destruction of the house. Is this Disney's latest hit, or a high Gothic horror story? When it comes to horror, I don't think the problem is that we're asking the wrong questions. There's nothing wrong with posing the question, is XYZ movie, book, video game, whatever, horror? Nothing wrong with that question at all. I think where we often go wrong is when we answer. Because we're often working from the idea that horror is something that's fixed and that it's absolute. And therefore, we approach horror as a list of criteria, even if we ignore the fact that we don't all agree on the same criteria. The result of this is that often when someone says, I watched a thing and it was horror, we often end up dismissing that person and their perspective. I think by reevaluating horror as cultural, as subjective, as flexible, what we gain is that we're able to walk inside someone's shoes and see their perspectives where we wouldn't normally see the same. So if someone came up to you and they said, hey, I saw The Gray, I thought it was horror. Instead of going to our lists and saying, well, you're wrong because whatever, we can instead re-examine The Gray and see what is horror about it. So is The Humans horror? Maybe. Maybe not to me. Maybe it is to you. I know for sure that it is to Alex West. And that makes it worth re-examining as a horror that is cultural, as monstrosity that is a cultural threat, and as something that we can re-examine for the benefit of others. Thank you very much for your time.